Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and welcome back to Goosejunkies, episode 18. We're glad that you're here with us tonight because we're going to be talking about superhero horror, and we picked probably the two biggest icons from the 90s to face off. We have Attack of the Mutant from Goosebumps facing off against the Tale of the Ghastly Grinner from Are You Afraid of the Dark? Tonight, we are joined with a smaller panel because I guess I'll go ahead and share the news. Bruce and Alex, Goosebumps for Dummies and Goosebumps enthusiasts, have left the podcast due to personal reasons, and we wish them all the best. But they will no longer be on the podcast, at least as of now. Like I said, we still support the guys, and we want you guys to still support them despite them not being on the podcast anymore. But we now have a smaller panel, and we're probably going to be able to do these a lot shorter now. So that's the trade-off. But nonetheless, we are joined with two excellent folks tonight. Micah from the Ultimate Goosebumps Man. How you doing tonight, Micah?
I'm doing pretty good. Had a pretty busy week with work and stuff, but I got to get home early, go home like 3 hours early yesterday, and I only had to work a 3 hour shift today. So,
Nice. And that must be really nice because I work like 10, 11-hour shifts. So, and then of course we're joined by the man, the myth, the legend, the mom slayer, BD Horror, also who runs the Horror Tavern. How are you doing tonight, BD?
Yo, 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 people and patrons of the night. It is your boy. I am BD, the baby mama bandit, the greatest supervillain out here right now in Chicago. And welcome back to the podcast. I wish I could also work 3 hour shifts because I am packed up this week in terms of working. But I'm excited because now it's the evening. We get to chill. And we're going to be talking about some fun segments because the stories that we're going to be discussing today are probably some of the most divisive amongst Goosebumps. And you're going to get some different takes in this episode. So I hope you guys are excited for our opinion. And of course, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It's free. The economy is expensive. And if you don't, the baby mama bandit is coming after you.
The most true words I've ever heard. And then, of course, Spongy. He is now like pretty much an off-screen panelist for the time being. We have his thoughts in a document, and we'll be reading off his thoughts as we go along as well. But Spongy, we miss you, and we wish that you were here, but we know that you're here in spirit and with your words. So it's glad that everybody is here tonight to talk about some superhero horror. Because to start it off, growing up, I was a big superhero fan, right? And in kids' horror, I guess we'll get into this in our discussion later. There's not a lot of kids' horror media revolved around superheroes. And when it is there, it's very hit or miss in terms of quality, I've come across, or they all have similar mechanisms where you have art coming to life or into reality almost, and there's a reality bending thing going on. And Attack of the Mutant, I think, was the first to really set the parameter in kids' horror next to Ghastly Grinner. I think they probably came around the same time because Ghastly Grinner was season 4 of Are You Afraid of the Dark, and Attack of the Mutant was like book 25, a few years into the run of Goosebumps. So, BD, why don't you start us off with Attack of the Mutant, book 25 from the classic series? What's your thought on the book, and what's the book about?
So, Attack of the Mutant, this is basically where it all began. A lot of us know that the Masked Mutant is one of the most iconic Goosebumps villains out there, and this is where basically the hype started from. So, what's the book about? This book takes place with the main character, Skipper. And Skipper might identify with some of you guys. In fact, Goosebumps Completionist background relates in some way to Skipper because he is a collector like a lot of us. He collects comic books and he keeps them in the plastic wrapping, of course. He tries to build them up for their value. And you even get some really cool references to the original Captain America comic and Spawn. So those are some cool little modern day, oh, not modern day, but in that time, sort of cool references. He collects comics and he has a friend named Wilson. Wilson collects stamps. They're both collectors. They don't understand each other, but they're pretty much good friends. But there is one comic series that Skipper does read, and he doesn't just do it for collecting, and that is The Masked Mutant. There is Masked Mutant comics that basically drop, and he always reads them. And he's a big fan of them because the Masked Mutant is the biggest, greatest supervillain of all time in this world, and he loves reading about it. Him fighting against the League of Good Guys. Stein put a lot of thought into that name right there, the League of Good Guys. Mass Mutant gets into a lot of cool battles with them. And in fact, the first comic that they introduce, the Mass Mutant is getting into an underwater fight scene with one of the characters, who I think is named Sponge Life or something. So shout out to Spongy. Spongy got a reference in this book. And you find out that the Mass Mutant's big power is that he can basically move his molecules around. And this gives him the ability to shapeshift into any solid matter, into basically any living or non-living item. And what happens is that as you kind of get introduced to Skipper's life, his parents aren't that supportive of his comics, and he has a hard time, being cool and finding friends in school. He has to take a bus ride for an orthodontist appointment. And when he takes this bus ride, he meets a girl named Libby. Libby's into comics. She's into like some type of comic, like I forgot the name of it, but he doesn't find it cool. He thinks it's a trash series, but he likes the fact that this girl is into collecting the same things that he is. And when he ends up getting lost in the conversation and gets off the bus stop with her, he sees something really weird. He sees this fire hydrant neon looking building. It's pink, it's got greens in it, and it stands out like a sore thumb. And he's really weirded out because he's like, why is this thing here? And he sort of recognizes it because he sees that he knows about the Mass Mutant having a lair that looks a lot like this from the comics, but that lair has never fully been shown. It's just been hinted and explained that it exists. So when he sees it, he's like, is this that lair from the Mass Mutant comic? We've never seen it, but it sounds a lot like it. And Libby's like, no, this building has been around since I've moved here, months back. I mean, it's weird, but I think it might just be an office building. So they kind of just let it go and don't worry about it. And then eventually Skipper tells his friend Wilson about it. Wilson kind of just shrugs it off, doesn't care about it. And eventually Skipper ends up going back to the same place, and he sees that the building is gone. And that really weirds him out and freaks him out. And when he gets back home, he gets sent a new issue of the Mass Mutant comic and finds out that the lair has an invisible cloak around it. So he thinks, well, this building disappeared out of nowhere. Is it possible that this is actually the Mass Mutant's lair and it does have a cloak around it? So he ends up going back there a third time, goes with Libby, they walk through, and they actually get past the cloak. And they actually enter the lair. And when they enter the lair, they start exploring it. Excuse me, they're really weirded out by it. And then Skipper finds out some stuff. He finds out that the comic might actually be involved with the real world, and his life might start getting involved with the comic world. And next thing you know, both timelines basically match up against each other. And now Skipper is put into a situation where he has to save one of the members of the League of Good Guys, the Galloping Gazelle, from being captured by the Mass Mutant and defeated. So he's now put into a high-stakes situation, and that's how the rest of the book goes. This book, to me, is pretty average, only because I enjoy some things, and I'm not going to talk specifically about the episode. I enjoy some things that this book did compared to the episode. I've read the book after I watched the episode, and I appreciate some of the things involving the comic book world that Stein tries to make, even though he doesn't explore it as much as he could. But the reason why I think this book is decent is because of the structure. This book structure involves a lot of back and forth, repetitive actions. Now, the majority of the story is basically you getting introduced to Skipper's hobby and passion, but then it then turns into for whatever 60 pages that he just keeps going back and forth between his house, the lair, his house, the lair, the house, the lair, and you start thinking that did Stein really know what he wanted to do with the story? Because it starts getting very repetitive. You don't get anything new out of it. And when you do explore the lair, excuse me, it's not interesting. The lair stuff is very mundane. You don't get these cool gimmicks in the lair. You don't explore this wild, zany world. You've probably seen movies that have crazy layers in them, and it's some of the most wacky, interesting stuff. For as a creative mind as R.L. Stein is, the layer stuff in this book is not that creative. It's not that interesting outside of a few neon colors and weird gimmicks. And when you do get into the Mass Mutant stuff, it is good. However, I have one big gaping problem with the Mass Mutant in this book and just in general for both stories. I understand that Skipper is going into the comic world. That makes sense to me. I think it's really cool. I like the way the book does the ending. I like the twist ending to this book. I think it's slightly dark and creative at the same time. But there's a big mystery and question that is never answered. How did the mass mutant get into the real world? Do you know? If you know, let us know, because nobody knows how the mass mutant got into the real world. How this layer ended up in the real world in this random town, zero explanation. If you try to go under the mindset that the mass mutant has the capability of writing his own stories inside of the comic book, does that make any sense to you? No, it didn't to me. That doesn't make any sense if you try to use that theory. So Stein does zero explanation as to why this is happening. Now, there's been authors out there like Stephen King who say the mystery behind weird stuff makes it more intriguing. I can get that, but this isn't that. This is not really a mystery. This is more so just like go gadget bullshit. It's like, okay, Stein didn't know how to explain why the mass mutant came into the real world. So you just got to roll with it, just pretend it works. But it's a gaping issue when you go into this plot line that Skipper can enter the comic book. So it's like, whoa. We would have let it go. But now you want to be like, oh, no. In fact, Skipper can enter the comic book because of this, and this reason. So you want to explain that, but you don't want to explain how the mutant got there. Okay, that's his priorities. So that's my big complaints with the book. I know this book is very much loved. I don't personally feel that way. I can get some of the iconic stuff behind it, but it definitely has its fair share of issues. The characters are okay. The plot structure is not that good. There's a big underlying mystery, but it's not the worst thing I've read. This is a pretty average book. It does have some fun stuff in it, and I commend it for that. I just wish there was more of it and there was a better structure. So those are my thoughts, but I'm very interested to hear both of you guys.
Yeah, great points, BD. I'm going to pass it over to Micah before I build on to what you said, because I'm curious to see what Micah thought about it, because he jumped up ahead of his reading schedule to read this. So, Micah, what's your thoughts on the book?
The book, it was okay. It's a very middle of the road Goosebumps book. I literally gave it a 5 out of 10. It's like right in the middle for me. You know, it's better than the episode. I'll give it that. But like there's just not much to it. BD covered a lot of the similar thoughts that I did. It's just all the characters are kind of bland overall. I think Skipper's fine as a main character, and he's just not the most interesting to me. To be fair, that's very common with Goosebumps protagonists, but you know, the Masked Mutant is still very fun and there's some kind of intrigue to him, but it's just very unexplained about a lot of the stuff he does. His motivations are kind of all over the place and just kind of what he wants to do with Skipper and just all this like like classic 90s commentary on like comic books will rot your brain stuff, and I feels like I don't know. I've never understood that mentality. Like it's the same thing like video games and stuff. Like I read comic books sometimes. I play video games. My brain's fine. So like I've never really understood why they had that mentality back in the day. And I feel like both in the book and in the episode, they kind of overplay that theme a little too much for me. But overall, it was still a decent read, very average. And yeah, this just wasn't really my main thing. And I don't really understand people who say this is one of the best.
Yeah, to add on to what both of you said, to preface this, this was a childhood favorite book of mine, but now as I read it as an adult, I kind of see why I loved it as a kid. And I'll get into that, but it's more for the superficialness of it. It's for the fact that it's a superhero book in Goosebumps. There's something about the novelty of that I think rings true. The monster, at least in terms of the original 62, the Masked Mutant sticks out for being a comic book villain. He sticks out for representing a subgenre of essentially literature that for years has been critically slammed and kind of overlooked, but has recently found more relevance. And especially in the 90s, why I think it was appropriate for that book to come out when it did was the book initially starts on the precipice of this idea that this book could have been a great commentary in Goosebumps about speculation and collection culture itself, about how you kind of remove yourself from the love and the passion when you get into the hobby of collecting. You're not worried about monetary value. You're not worried about your future income. You're not worried about the love of things. And what I think this book does very well, at least in terms of characters, while they are kind of bland, Wilson and Libby, the two other side main characters of the story, they serve as a stark contrast to Skipper. Skipper in the book, he's very dismissive, he's very judgmental of his friend's interests. But when you look at Wilson, yeah, he's into collecting things that really don't have any monetary value, but he has passion behind it. That's what fuels his collecting. And then you have Libby. She collects like Archie knockoff comics that Skipper doesn't respect, but she collects comics herself, but she collects because of her interests as well. She's into niche things, but she's fueled by interest and she actually reads. Skipper, he's essentially a comic poser. He has a Jack Kirby Captain America poster and a Todd McFarlane Spawn poster. Typical 90s fandom stuff. Todd McFarlane was one of the co-founders of Image. Image Comics made some of the highest printed comic books in the history of comic book making in the 90s, which destroyed the speculation market because everybody bought all the issue number ones and they were sitting on hundreds and possibly thousands of copies that are now dollar bin fodder because they're worthless. So the missed opportunity with this book, and I think if Stein actually understood comic book culture a little more, could have made a nice woven story, is the fact that Skipper kind of has to learn that the value of this comic book character that he holds in such high regard uh, in his collection as a whole doesn't amount to anything. There's no fulfillment in it, and there's a missed arc he could have had with that, and there's thematic stuff he could have told with that. And honestly, there's missed opportunities even with showcasing the main villain, the masked mutant, and kind of going over, I think, important plot details that had just got skimmed over because Stein initially started off with this cool idea, but then, like BD highlighted, he derailed into a mystery slow burn where Skipper is uncovering information as he's getting these mailed comics in from the Masked Mutant, the only comic that he reads. He started to notice that little details add on to things he needs to know. But that's not the real gripping part of the story. And I feel like Stein missed the mark on that. And in regards to that, I still think that this book is relatively short. It's 117 pages. It's a brisk read. It reads fine, but it's just not engaging. The plot isn't interesting, right? This is definitely an easily digestible Goosebumps book, but it doesn't click on until like page 85. That's like in the back half in the final act of the book. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what Stein was going for here. I mean, there's so many things that you can throw out there that sound like easy changes, or maybe you can just throw out the concept and make something new that would suffice. But I think this book, it does have a redeemable final act. I think the final act does kind of save it for me, and the ending is really dark, or not really dark, but it's slightly dark and ambiguous, but in that creepy way. And I still like some ideas there, but like BD said, there's really no explanation where it counts. You don't know how the mutant came into the real world, but there's explanation about how Skipper can turn his molecules into comic book ink. So why is that there? But why is the mutant here? Is it delusion from Skipper, or is the comic being written in reality itself? Like it's never, it's so ambiguous, and it's kind of contradictory to certain parts of the book where when Skipper's in the lair, it's kind of implied that he's in a comic book, not in reality. So like, what is it? It's too weird, and I think it has too many ideas that it doesn't know how to manage. But I think this book is average. I think I'm a little more fair than you guys are on it, but I also have nostalgia with it, and I do think that Mutant, some people will say what you will about the book itself. I do think that there is a lot of room for stories with the character, and I do think that he could have spawned a franchise and possibly improved on his future outings. This could have been one of those franchises where you have maybe a solid or a general idea of where to start with the mutant, but you can definitely build on different concepts and maybe make something better. But I gave this one like a 3.8 out of 5, or maybe like a 7.6 out of 10. But that's my absolute ceiling for it. So. And that's what I gave it. Anything else before we get to Spongy's thoughts? All right, let's get to Spongy's thoughts, and then we'll move on to the episode, which I think is going to be the spicier version of this story.
For sure.
All right, let's pull up Spongy's thoughts. Give me 1 second. Okay, so these are his thoughts about the Attack of the Mutant book. I like this one fine, but I have cooled on it over the years. It has some strong ideas with the comic fan discovering that a villain may be real as all these signs pop up, like the headquarters. There are some themes it flirts with but doesn't quite commit to, Mass Mutant is as fun as the Galloping Gazelle, and it mostly flows all right with some amusing moments like the gazelle scene. But the boy Skipper sucks early on with his behavior. The Libby not aging well, lol. He doesn't quite grow up by the end, although he gets a win against the mutant at least. It can feel like it takes too long to truly get going, and the possible themes of escapism with Skipper being so into comics, which are looked down on, aren't fully taken advantage of. It's driven by the ideas it puts in your head more than anything. But for the first comic book one and a goofier one, it works decently. Hey, at least it's not Dr. Maniac. Lol.
That's a good point. And I do like Spongy's idea of escapism for a theme of the book too. That honestly could be a good thing to be woven into the story as well, because you do see that contrast with Skipper's dad and Skipper's opinions about comics. But that's never really played into all that much. It's just kind of there in some scenes, but it's not played into as a theme. That's another thing you could throw into the ring of missed opportunity. But I think we're all in some sort of agreements that it's kind of fine, kind of mid average. So, Micah,
Mhm.
take us away on the episode. Like, what's the episode story, and what's your thoughts on that?
So the episode story, it's pretty much the book. There's not much that they changed with it overall. There's some minor things here and there, like the characterization of Skipper is a bit different, where he actually likes comics. He actually reads the comics. He doesn't just collect them for the monetary gain like he does in the book. And then there's such arbitrary little things changed, like Wilson being a rock collector instead of stamp collector. Okay. But yeah, the plot is, we mentioned the plot is very similar to the book in a lot of ways. Very slow burn. This episode is a two-parter, and it opens up with Skipper reading one of the Masked Mutant comics, and we get some really, it is kind of a fun opening with like the shots of the comic panels and then the voice acting from Scott Wickware and Adam West voicing the Masked Mutant and the Galloping Gazelle. I thought that was really fun, kind of a way to open it and set the tone a bit. But the art in the comic books doesn't look that great. And like, it's just kind of I don't know, it's kind of sets the episode off on a fun yet kind of weird note. And then you meet Skipper, and again, as I mentioned, his characterization is better than the book, I would say, just because he actually has a passion for the comic reading. But then you meet his parents, and his parents are one of the worst parents in any Goosebumps media ever, in my opinion, because they're very over the top. The dad is this kind of almost George McFly looking guy who's basically completely against comic books and acts like Skipper's wasting his life away reading them, much like in the book. Then you got Skipper's mom, who is just this complete ditz, who's just literally off in her own little world half of the time. She's very just she's very soft towards how she parents her son, very kind of indifferent towards anything like that. And it's just, I don't know, it's a really weird parent dynamic. And like, you would not think these two would ever be a married couple at all, and let alone be the parents to Skipper. And then, uh, again, there's a lot of similar stuff to the book. I don't really know how else to describe it. Like, my brain just turns off during this episode. I'm sorry. But I might as well just get into my thoughts because again, the plot's very similar. I hate this episode. Just to put it slightly. This may be a hot take, I don't know. And there's a very divisive way this episode is. Some people love it, some people hate it. In my opinion, this is the second worst episode of the whole show. And it's just barely beats out Teacher's Pet. And there's just a lot of reasons why I think that. I think that there's just awful acting from pretty much everybody aside from like Skipper. He's decent. I think I like the guy who plays him. He's better in Click, but I think he's fine. Of course, Scott Wickware is the Masked Mutant. He's great, and I'll get into more of that when I move on to like the positive thing I have to say about, which I guess I might as well just say the positive now, is Scott Wickware as the mutant. This guy is awesome. He has such a fun kind of energy to the character that just really makes him engaging to watch. The laugh is iconic. He has just, you can just tell he was having a blast in this role, and he really just helps bring that character to life and add that kind of fun element to the final act of this episode. And I just kind of wish we got to see more of him. But the pace is atrocious. Like, the fact that this episode is a two-parter, it does not need to be. It could easily have gotten away with being a 20-minute episode because part one is so boring. There's barely anything that happens in part one. There might be little things here and there, But overall, it's just there's nothing that's going on. It's just all set up, building up to the payoff in part 2. And it's kind of underwhelming, honestly, in part 2. I just like there's so many awful things that they did with this. The characters, other than Skipper, are boring. There's just really bad pacing, bad writing. The sets, while interesting design-wise, when you first get into the mutant's lair, it's just this terrible green screen effect of Skipper and Libby just standing in front of this clear, like, there's some parts that may look three-dimensional, but like the front wall with the doors, obviously just a giant painting. There's like all these like really weird flashing lights, and I think the outside of the mutants headquarters does look kind of cool, but when you go inside, it's very lackluster, especially in the final act. Like, it's interesting design wise, but there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't work for me. Adam West as the Galloping Gazelle. While it's fun to see Adam West in this show, he doesn't really do much. He's in there for like probably 5 minutes max, and then he just ditches Skipper once he gets too much for him. and there's just and there's okay, I gotta mention the other thing. Libby, her actress is awful. She might be one of the worst actresses I've seen in Goosebumps. Like, there's just no emotion in her performance at all. She's just, I know some people have kind of said, like, basing on the twist of, kind of spoiler alert for the twist ending, with one of the twists of the masked mutant being disguised as Libby. I saw someone in the Discord say that the reason Libby's acting is so awful is because the masked mutant is trying to act like a teenage girl. No, this actress is just terrible. I'm sorry. That's not it. It's just bad acting. You can't write yourself out of that one, no matter how much you try to excuse it. And then the twist ending, it's a fun twist ending. Like, it's very memorable, but I still don't like it. I think it's just goofy, and that's the main problem with this episode. It's not scary. There is nothing remotely scary about this episode one bit. There's so many just, I don't know. I've said my piece. I don't really know what else I can say about it that's positive or negative. I'm very neutral to just hate this episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have some solid points, and I guess I'll share my thoughts before we get into BD, because I do have some interesting ones about this episode. When I first watched it as a middle schooler, like when I was like 12 or 13, I absolutely hated this episode. Like, I thought it was the biggest diss to one of my childhood favorite books, and I actually went back and reread the book and realized the book even wasn't even all that. So I was like kind of like crushed, to say the least, coming across the episode for the first time. And for years, I hated this episode vehemently, but I've kind of softened up on it over time. But here's the thing about two-parters in the Goosebumps show. I think there's two lesser products when it comes to that. It's Deep Trouble and this episode. This one is a little bit on a different level than Deep Trouble's episode, in my opinion. But here's the thing. To react to a comment, I had a review for the episode, and somebody left an interesting comment about this being a slow burn and how people don't have the patience for this type of story anymore. That's why you see all this newfound hate for this episode. Let me just address that. Slow burns are a crescendo. You're going up the mountain. You have wound up tension that builds and escalates and then releases. This episode is kind of like a flat line on a heart reading monitor, and then a defibrillator randomly comes in the second part and just beeps it, and it just spikes up. That's what this episode is. You don't have gripping tension in this story. It has the same sins that the first 75 pages of this book had, basically, minus the fact that Skipper is now more likable and he has more characterization, and he's not a comic poser and speculator anymore. You kind of remove that from the story. Now they're rolling with the idea comics rot your brain. So this is the episode, or I should say Dan Angel and Billy Brown's way of explaining how the mutant comes into the real world. It's because Skipper has brain rot from comics. But nonetheless, you have the book here. It's what we did talk about in the book where BD went over the plot. It's literally just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But now you have the visual medium of a low budget 90s show dragging this, because let me say this up front. Reading the book, it's kind of briskly paced, but watching this can be agonizing at times. Like I said, because there's no wound tension. You know what a perfect example of a slow burn in Goosebumps is? Werewolf of Fever Swamp's two-parter. And you know, the director of that episode directed this episode too. So how can you go from Werewolf of Fever Swamp with great wound tension, non-contextual things that really matter, like mutants build up in part one is more for contextual things that matter in part two. No, you actually have gripping events in both parts. You have storylines and characters kind of coming together and developing in part one that matter in part two. You have tension, you have intrigue, mystery. You have none of that in part one of this episode here. Let me tell you, Tag the Mutant Part 1 has to be the most boring Goosebumps episode of all time. I said it, but it is boring because of that exact reason. Part 2 is what makes this episode what it is. And I've said it in my review. This is one of those token times where I don't think that the 21-minute time crunch really served this specific story the best justice. Honestly, they could have trimmed out about 10 minutes of part one. They could have trimmed out about 6 to 7 minutes, maybe 8 minutes of part two, and you could have had maybe a 30-something minute episode here, max. That would have been perfectly fine. You cut out the fluff, you make it more streamlined than the book was, and you possibly could, if you wanted to flesh out by trimming out the fat, you can create more aspects to the book that weren't there. That's normally what these episodes do. They try to improve on the source material, but this just feels like Dan Angel and Billy Brown were just collecting a paycheck. They didn't really try with this one. But I will say to the production team and to Scott Wickware and to Adam West, who played the Galloping Gazelle, and even to Dan Wary Smith, who played Skipper, their acting performances really did save it. And that part two does get fun. And I will say this, the ending to this episode, as corny as it can be, is iconic. The stretching bit, I don't care what you say. That's probably one of the more recognizable moments from the Goosebumps TV show, love it or hate it. And I love it for that. It has this weird charm to it. And I can see past some of the really dated effects and see that they actually did try to make the mutants layer somewhat exciting here. There was some effort put into that side of things when it came to the practical, and the mutants costume looked really good for a low budget 90s show. So I'd probably give this like a 3.2 out of 5 stars, which is a meh for me, a 6.4 out of 10. Edie, I'm gonna pass it over to you now. Given everything me and Micah said, what's your thoughts on Attack of the Mutants episode?
The Attack of the Mutants episode is one of those cases that, as a kid, I remember liking this episode more. I liked the more sort of aesthetic feel of it, some of the things that were in there, the more goofy stuff. And then I became an adult, and then I watched this and I start recognizing more of the problems. I do want to cover some of the positives, though, that I do like about the episode. First of all, Skipper. Skipper is an improvement, as these guys have mentioned, compared to the book. In the book, he's one of those guys that he doesn't actually read the stuff. He just collects it, lets it sit on his shelf for value, doesn't actually read anything except for the Masked Mutant. Here, he's actually a fan of it. And I like the actor in the episode. He was in Click, and I do agree I like him better in Click. But here, I think he does a good enough job, too. I think he's a good, sympathetic, charming kid. Yeah, he's got some goofy moments in there, but they're not like bad acting goofy moments. No, it's like that's part of his character. You resonate with him. And him being the sort of like, chubbier kind of loser kid, the fact that he's getting, this opportunity where he gets to be more like a superhero, I think that little bit of like comeuppance is kind of cool. And I like that aspect to it. I think he's sort of like the people's hero in terms of characters for Goosebumps. Two good things that I'll rope in together. Scott Wickware as the Masked Mutant. Dude, you did a good job. I like the Masked Mutant in this episode. I like his costume. One of my favorite scenes, I think the most iconic scene in this episode to me, aside from that whoopee cushion twist ending, is that the scene of the Masked Mutant jumping on top of the bus. I think that was a fun scene. I love seeing the Masked Mutant jump on there, laugh maniacally on top of the bus while his cape is flapping in the wind while they're going on the road. I think it's a really cool scene. I think that the layer of the Masked Mutant is more colorful. It's more fun. It's kind of like and I've seen this movie, a couple of days ago. I rewatched it. It's kind of like a great value version of the Killer Clowns from Outer Space layer with the bright colors and the unique gimmicks. That layer and that movie is fantastic, but obviously it's more budget, more time. This is sort of a watered down version of that. And there is some bad visual effects. There's some really bad green screen running things involving the layer. But when you do actually see the practical stuff in the layer set, I think it's pretty good. And the control room place, I think, is pretty cool as well. Adam West from the original Batman, he does a good job in here. I think he's the best acting, I guess, person in this episode. I think he's very charming. I think he's very funny. The scene of him waiting on top of the stairs for Skipper to finish because he's not a superhero, I thought that was pretty funny. And some of the running gags that he does are pretty funny as well. So he's a very charming guy. He's got a great voice. You know, this goes for his role in Batman. This goes for here. Adam West has an amazing superhero voice back in like the old days. So I love his voice here. And that's pretty much all the real positives I have. Let's get into the negatives. And I'm going to be using some of the stuff in the book to compare now against the episode. The book does a better job with the mass mutant in terms of explaining his powers and the threat level he has. In the book, it explains that he's able to shift around his molecules. That's what allows the shape shifting. You get the scene in the comic book where he's underwater as a giant octopus kraken thing, and it's wearing the mass mutant mask. So he's fighting against some of the League of Good Guys people. There's multiple superheroes mentioned in the book. There's the Galloping Gazelle, obviously, that's in the episode. But then there's Sponge Life, that guy. And then there's also the, I think, Magnificent Molecule Man, which comes in the climax. So you get more superheroes in the book. You get more characters. And again, the mass mutant is more threatening. In the climax scene, when he's facing off against the Galloping Gazelle is using his super speed to race around the mass mutant. And the mass mutant, and I thought this was clever because I'm a wildlife guy. I like wildlife. The fact that the mass mutant turned into a leopard, which is the apex predator of a gazelle, and then starts using that to scare off the superhero. I thought that was actually more threatening, pretty clever. Is it goofy? Yeah, but it's a comic book. So I thought it was pretty comically fun that he turns into a leopard with the mass mutant mask on it and scares away the Galloping Gazelle. Obviously, for budget, they can't do that. But Jesus Christ, the Galloping Gazelle in the climax is a goofball. I mean, he is embarrassing as a character. The Galloping Gazelle in the episode's climax, as a way to counter, first of all, he sits on top of the chair. The chair is the mass mutant. The masked mutant let another man sit on his lap. I'm just gonna put it out there. That's a little sus, bruh. You just let that man sit on your crotch like that? Okay. And then on top of that, you have the fact that the masked mutant, you have the fact that the Galloping Gazelle starts twirling like a whirlwind. And it's extremely bad. I mean, this dude is just spinning. It's a giant swirling effect. And he's doing nothing. He's just spinning to himself outside of the mass mutant's distance from Skipper. So it just looks like he's doing like ballet twirls for no reason. And it's just like the most stupid thing. Imagine you got this legendary villain and all he's doing is this. I mean, bro, am I supposed to be intimidated by this? This is all he does the entire climax. And then he all of a sudden runs away. He just runs away because of the fact that, oh, I'm old, kid. I got to dip out of here. Now, Adam West's delivery of that was funny, but I was like, what was the point of the Galloping Gazelle other than a plot point? You're just there just to make sure that Skipper has a reason to be there. There's no actual threat. There's no actual thing going on. So I thought that was really stupid. And that's essentially like the negatives involving that. Libby, holy cow. Go back to flipping burgers, man. That acting performance was horrible, bro. McDonald's is hiring. I'm sorry. She's clearly reading off a script. I know there's that theory to save her actress. That theory is bullshit. Come on, man. She was just reading off a script. It is such bad acting, especially compared to Skipper. And Skipper's a pretty good actor. So when you put a pretty good actor against a really bad actor, it's very much clear how bad she is as an actress. And again, maybe it was her first role. Maybe she's new to this. I get it. But you couldn't have at least taken some classes to know you don't read off of a script. I mean, they probably weren't paying her much, but literally there's points where they're walking in the lair and she'll be like, "You're into comics? Wow, that's so sad. You're in the lair. You're in the lair. You're in there with him. Why are you clowning him about comics? You're in the damn lair. Are you not seeing your surroundings?" And obviously there's that reveal of who Libby is tying to the villain. I get that. But just before you have that context, the acting is just bad and it's not good. And even that bus scene was cringe. The bus scene is very accurate to the book, but the book you at least get some back and forth. Here, it just seems like Libby's out of place. She just doesn't know what to do. The parents in this episode. I like the fact that the mom is more sympathetic in the episode. She's nicer towards Skipper. In the book, comparatively, she was like, "Oh, why are you reading comic books? Why don't you read some real novels?" And she's giving him a hard time. But man, Michael was right. The dynamic between the dad and the mom is cringe. The mom is reading romance novels, and she tries to like lean in for a kiss for her husband, and her husband just ignores her. So she's like yearning for some like romance in her life. I guess she's not getting enough in the bedroom, so she's very disappointed in that. And she makes it clear there's some innuendos here that she's not been getting anything for the past months. The dad is cringe because he not only trashes on Skipper's comic habits, but then there's a scene where, and this was pretty clever. Skipper put the comic book inside of the algebra book, and then he closes it. So when the dad, sees Skipper, he's like thinks that he's reading an algebra book. And Skipper's like, "Hey, Dad, were you ever good at algebra?" And the dad's just like, "Nah, I sucked at algebra." And then there's literally a 10-second awkward silence where Skipper's looking at the dad's looking at Skipper, and then the dad's like, "All right, buddy, go back to your reading." And then he just walks off. There's a lot of just useless scenes. I mean, that was literally 10 seconds of awkward silence that just adds to the plot being mundane. And again, that's part one. That's part two. But part one and part two, there's a lot of just scenes that could have been cut down. I honestly think that a better direction for this episode would have been, and the writers and producers have taken liberty, just have Skipper see in the newest issue of the Masked Mutant that the building is like there amongst these like industrial buildings. Then he gets to the layer for the first time. And let's say in the book, let's say in the first issue that he gets introduced to, it says that, oh, the Masked Mutant's layer actually has this invisibility cloak. So when he gets dropped off the first time at the bus stop, he sees that exact painted scene from the comic. He sees that there's no building. Libby's with them, and he gets curious. He decides, "Hey, do you mind if we just walk through over there?" And she's like, "Okay, why not?" And when they walk over there, they get past the cloak, they see the lair, they go in, and then the next time when he has to get back to the lair, it's to save the Galloping Gazelle. 2 layer visits. That's all you needed. You didn't need to go back and forth like the book did. It drags out time. And honestly, I think I would give this episode a 5.5 out of 10. That's basically like a meh, leaning towards kind of bad. I think the episode is kind of bad as a whole, but I give it a 5.5 simply for the reason that I think Adam West's performance, Skipper's performance, and the Masked Mutant's performance are fun enough. But outside of that, I don't really get the hype behind this episode. And those are my thoughts. This is a very sort of middle of the road episode.
Yeah, and also to add on to that, I've mentioned this before we started, but from when the Goosebumps Crew podcast that I'm occasionally in, we did a interview with Scott Wickware, who played the Masked Mutant, and even he said this episode doesn't hold up. So any gatekeepers towards this episode who say it's one of the best, the Masked Mutant actor himself said it wasn't great. And even he said that it should have been a one-part episode. So I think that just goes to say everything right there.
Yeah, I made an interesting comment in my review. I think they probably should have just made this in name only and just did a whole new concept from scratch. Because as is, the concept wasn't that interesting. It didn't make that much sense. Didn't have much thematic message to it. It just kind of existed. I would have done something completely different if I was a show writer and just made a whole new concept, gone Haunted Mask 2 or slightly Dummy 3 with it and just cranked it up a little bit, made it more fun and entertaining for the visual medium of a television show and not as mundane as the book. That's why I think this was kind of lazy on Dan Angel and Billy Brown's part. And I also think that they picked the wrong director because this has a very similar quality to another Are You Afraid of the Dark episode called The Tale of the Full Moon. It has this John Waters feel to it, like Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes almost. They should have put Ron Oliver as the director on this episode. If anybody was going to direct an Attack of the Mutant episode, I would have thought they would have picked Ron Oliver for this gig, but they didn't do it. So missed opportunity there. But let's get into Spongy's thoughts before we declare the victor, and then of course go over to the tale of the Ghastly Grinner.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment too. I think that a good example of a Goosebumps episode, and this is obviously an original to the show, one that is over the top, goofy, is comical, but is well paced and is good, is Trilogy. So they could have taken some elements from what they planned with Trilogy and incorporated it into Attack of the Mutant. I think if some of that direction was brought into here, they could have really made a nice paced episode with some cool stuff. But it is what it is.
All right, so here's Spongy's thoughts about the episode. So he says that the Attack of the Mutant episode, there's been more hate for this episode over time, but I like it. It improves on the book by going more into the theme somewhat. They beat you over the head with how others think that comics are rotting his mind, but I do like this aspect. They make it so Skipper is frankly the only normal one, despite what they say. It's shown that the mom has her own escapism with romance novels, which is a nice touch. It doesn't quite fully say anything, but it still shows Billy Brown and Dan Angel trying to bring their own ideas to what Stein laid out. I enjoy the over-the-top people like the dad, and of course Adam West as the Gazelle is a win. It's legit funny with the lines and interactions, and it nicely keeps a lot of the book's dialogue. Also prefer the stretching ending over the book's twist, as that one was treated as a shock when it really wasn't. I think it mostly earned the two parts, as the book had a fair bit going on when you put it all down, so a single episode, it would be messy as they crammed it all in. It can drag, especially in part one with a bit too much walking around. I see how some of the over-the-top parts can be a bit much for some, but overall I think the episode's fairly solid and I still enjoy it on the rewatch.
I mean, at least he's honest and gives the criticisms a fair shake. And I know this is one of Spongy's personal favorite episodes, and I can see why it's divisive. It is entertaining, at least to me, in part two. Like, if I had anything to praise about it, it would be that second part. If we're just talking part two by itself, that would be a pretty good episode. But it's not by itself, so it's kind of married to this part one, which is just not what you need a slow burn starter to be. So I guess when it comes to us four, Spongy might be in the minority on this one, but I think we are at three in a consensus that the book is better, right? So that leads us into Are You Afraid of the Dark's counterpart, which came out around the same time. It's called The Tale of the Ghastly Grinner. And if you've never heard of The Tale of the Ghastly Grinner, you need to move the rock from above you, because it is one of the more popular, if not more iconic episodes from that 90s show. And if you don't know anything about it, there were 3 episodes picked to be retro, I guess, backdoor releases on the season 1 of the Revival DVD. Now, I'm not talking about the 2000 Revival, I'm talking about the 2019 Revival. You know what they were? They were Dead Man's Float, Laughing in the Dark, and Ghastly Grinner. Ghastly Grinner, okay? This concept, right, is kind of similar to Attack the Mutant. It's about a character played by a young Amos Crowley, who went on to star as Chuck Green in the Haunted Mask episodes. And his character is super into comics, but unlike Skipper, he's actually involved. He's an artist. He mails out his art to different studios, but unlucky for him, nobody's really taken a chance on him, partly because of his age and partly because of his art and experience. Well, one day a new comic shop opens in this area, and he decides to go visit it. And he meets this eclectic comic shop runner. And this comic shop, I should say, is decorated completely in that 90s, early 2000s way that comic shops were decorated. It's super nostalgic. It puts you in that 90s vibe, and it's well done for that. But that aside, the woman running the counter kind of sees that this kid is well versed in comics and knows that he knows his stuff and not to give him any BS. So she cuts the rigmarole and pulls out this briefcase and says, "This was my father's comic. He mysteriously vanished," and kind of gives some background to it. But she opens up the briefcase and shows him this comic called The Ghastly Grinner, and saying that it's the only one in existence, and that she is totally trustworthy with this kid to be bequeathed the comic. Well, because the kid understands how rare it is and all that, but also being really into art, he notices the art looks super gripping. So he takes it to school with him, and there, I think he meets a girl named Patty. I want to say her name is Patty, but I don't think that's her name. But she has pigtails and glasses. She's kind of nerdy looking, but this girl might have a crush on him in their science class, and he's reading the comic behind one of his textbooks, and his dickhead teacher notices this and decides to throw his comic into the fish tank, which ruins it and gets it waterlogged. So the kid when he takes it home later, tries to dry it off by putting it into a microwave. And what causes that, and there's actually symmetry to the science class from earlier because they were learning about microwaves. But what this causes is that the Ghastly Grinner on the cover of the comic gets blown up and brought to life and crashes through the house and turns his parents into mind controlled zombies, essentially. And because this has happened, the main character now has to go to the girl he befriended to get help because it seems like there's not going to be any help to have that he can trust. And throughout the rest of the story, we see some interactions with the Ghastly Grinner in various forms, whether he's possessing people. Like the bus driver scene is probably one of the most iconic parts about this episode because the guy's head snaps back and there's blue goo gushing out of his mouth like blood. There's something about that scene that I think was kind of envelope pushing, even for that time standards, but how shocking that looked and how great the practical effects looked. But the story crescendos. The science teacher may or may not get possessed. It winds the characters up into the comic shop to settle the climax. But the climax happens off screen mostly because the main character decides that his idea is to maybe finish the work of the creator because we learn more about the story about the missing creator. And the character comes to realize that he's destined to finish the story and right himself to fix the mistake of the former creator. And he may or may not do so inside the comic realm, but because the show is low budget, we only get to see the people hang out inside of the comic shop. Well, let's just say things may or may not shake out in the kid's favor, and we see a typical happy-go-lucky, Are You Afraid of the Dark, kumbaya ending. But in this case, it feels more earned, and there's some solid character progression along with it. So with that out the way, I love this episode. I think this is definitely a deserved classic. If we're ever going to slap the term classic onto an Are You Afraid of the Dark episode, this is one. For one of the more overhyped episodes, I will say this episode's overhyped in some aspects, but it does deserve it. You know what I mean? And I can give a lot of accolades to this. I already brought up the guy who should have directed Attack the Mutant, but Ron Oliver directed this episode, and it shows why he should have directed Attack of the Mutant because he made this before he would have made that, and it's, in my opinion, clearly better. I think while the story does have some logic things, like the microwave bits and how unsensical that is at least is an explanation, and the episode doesn't waste time with it. It clearly shows you that that's what brings him to life and all of that. You can roll with the idea because it at least makes sense cognitively. The character has a well-developed arc where he's a struggling artist, but he learns his purpose and learns that maybe working on the Ghastly Grinner and what will give him some newfound confidence that will lead him into what ultimately is that ending. It's kind of campy and cheesy, like Attack the Mutant tried to be at times, but it leans into that way more. And honestly, the Ghastly Grinner, y'all, is nightmare fuel. Okay, he is way scarier than the mutant. The things that this character does to characters in the story is absolutely scary. I mean, the parent scene, great, with the blood coming out of the mouth. The bus driver scene, iconic. When he reveals his true form to the kids for the first time, tell me would not have scared you when you were like 10 years old. That his teeth are rotted and yellow, and his suit just looks so goofy, but his face makeup looks kind of decrepit and makes him look more menacing. There's something about it that just really works. And my only real negative with this story is honestly the climax being off screen. But I kind of tie that to the budget restraints. But I do wish we got to see the Ghastly Grinner get to meet the main character of the story like on screen a little bit. I do feel like that was kind of a cop out. But other than that, I think this episode's super solid. I give this like a 4.8 out of 5 or 9.6 out of 10. Super good episode. I put it in my great column. So I'm gonna pass it over to BD for this one. BD, what's your thoughts on the Tale of the Ghastly Grinner?
This is an episode that I've seen before, and I did like it back in the day. And actually, I actually raised the score of this episode upon a rewatch. So I would actually give this episode an 8.8 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10, which means that this is a great episode in my opinion. Some of the things that I love about this episode, first of all, Amos Crowley, he's in here. I love the fact that he's the main character. He's actually a protagonist. Chuck Green is great. We love the fact that Chuck Green is funny. He's an iconic character. But seeing, Amos actually be the main character actually get the focus and show off some of his acting chops, some of the ways that he can be very sympathetic. I love seeing that, and I think he's a good main character. Some of the things that I like about this episode, I love the fact that, unlike, I don't want to compare it too much to Mass Mutant's story just yet, but compared to Mass Mutant, where he's a collector, here the main character actually wants to be a comic writer. He wants to actually make comics. He wants to be successful, and he actually is like embodying the whole interest of it because he one day hopes to be in a similar position to some of his favorite comic artists and authors and stuff. So I think that that's very admirable. I love the way that the comic shop is incorporated into this episode. It's very homey. It feels very nice. A lot of us have probably been in similar comic shops before, so we can all relate to it. And it's just a nice way to see that this kid is finally getting some new opportunities into the comic world. And when you get introduced to this once in a lifetime comic, the Ghastly Grinner comic that was never completed, that's a really unique thing. Unlike Attack of the Mutant, where you're getting a, basically issue every single time that's getting released. No, this is a rare thing. This is a special object, something that has some, mystique to it. I very much enjoy that. The Ghastly Grinner, hands down, is the most fun Are You Afraid of the Dark villain out there. Easily, without a doubt. He's the most fun villain, and he's iconic. The Ghastly Grinner is terrifying. He's very much like the kids' horror version of the Joker. I know people say that the Masked Mutant is the Joker. No, he's not, dude. The Masked Mutant is a comical, over-the-top villain. Yes, we like him, but he's that typical, ha ha, I'm evil just to be evil. I got a giant fish tank with sharks in it. That kind of, villain. But the Ghastly Grinner is a psychopath. He laughs maniacally. He's got this giant Joker grin. He's got a jester costume, like a warped jester costume that he goes around in. And the fact that he can turn people into these mindless, laughing, crazy zombies with the blue goo coming out of them, I thought that was really nice. Similar like the Joker's laughing gas, the way that he can turn people maniacal. This is how the Ghastly Grinner does it. But I actually prefer this because the Ghastly Grinner is basically making zombies, mindless slaves that can basically assist them and stuff. So that's very cool. I actually like the microwave stuff involving this episode because if you've ever read, pulp comics, older comics, they always do this sort of sort of wonky, crazy ideas that can basically turn things into wild stuff. There was obviously this big craze over radiation. I mean, look at the Hulk. Radiation has always been used in comics as a way to basically create some wild stuff. And then you have here the fact that you mix radiation with actual comics, it brings it to life. So I like those homages and stuff. And yeah, overall, very fun episode. And I like the climax involving the comic book stuff. It was obviously done due to a lack of budget, as completion is brought up, but I think that has some charm to it. I like that comics are incorporated in that way. And I actually like the side by side dialogue, the action sequences that happen as you go from comic panel to comic panel. A modern day example of that kind of reminds me of like Creep Show, Bad Wolf Down. That episode involved the transformation sequences of the werewolves being just comic pages flipping through. And I think this one is basically taking an action scene that would have been hard to do, incorporating it into a comic. That's pretty clever. And yeah, kumbaya ending, but he earned it, god damn it. This character earned it. He worked and went through a lot of crazy stuff. Potentially his life and the entire world was at jeopardy, and he solved it in a very clever way. He stepped up to the plate. And the fact that he gets to be a new comic artist that is basically getting his stuff signed, that made me smile, and I enjoyed that. So I give this one a great score. This is probably an 8.8, 9 out of 10. I definitely recommend all of you guys see it. This is easily one of the best kids horror comic stories out there. There's a couple others that are better in my opinion, but this is up there with the top 3 that I've ever seen.
Great points. And I like the fact that you brought up that one thing about radiation in comics. I never really thought of that, but that is very relevant, especially in Atomic Age comics. Like radiation was almost always involved with character origins or even in horror stories. Like a lot of that, like the zombie craze, was born out of radiation and that idea that it consumes the earth, thus it's going to consume what you eat, thus it's going to consume humanity itself. So radiation, microwaves, it's the same thing. So it's kind of a love letter to that. So I like that you brought that up. Clever. So yeah, let's pass it over to Micah. Micah, what's your thoughts on the Tale of the Ghastly Grinner?
Well, this is actually a first time watch for me, and this is easily my favorite episode of Dark that we've watched so far for this podcast. It was awesome. Just like the way they did the Ghastly Grinner was great. Just like he's a genuinely scary villain, which is what I love about Dark. It's like unlike Goosebumps, which can have some scary moments in villains, but usually the villains are kind of silly. Dark is not afraid to actually have genuinely scary monsters and villains. And I love that about that. It doesn't really speak in some of the villains, they don't speak down to kids. Like the pool zombie from Dead Man's Float is a prime example of that. But yeah, the Grinner is terrifying and the things he does is like that laugh is awesome and just the way he just again, as you mentioned, the way he affects these people and turns them into these mindless zombies is really awesome. The bus driver scene, as you guys have all mentioned, that scene shocked me. I was not expecting to see that in a kid's show, with like the head snapping all the way around and stuff, and just like you can just tell that actor was having a blast too. Just like the scene, that like front shot where he's just like manically driving the bus with that like manic grin on his face. Like you can tell the actor was having a blast doing that. And it was fun seeing Amos Crawley in this. And yes, knowing from him in Haunted Mask 1 and 2. And also a fun fact, if you didn't know, for Amos Crawley, he also did another role in Goosebumps as a main protagonist, but only doing ADR. He was the ADR for Larry in My Harriest Adventure.
Ooh, that's actually pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. And like so I never realized that until we learned about it in Goosebumps crew and did an interview with him.
Was Larry's actor that bad? They had to use Amos Crowley to replace him in ADR.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, what a champ! But continue.
But yes, that was kind of a fun thing to see him there. And this is obviously like before he did Goosebumps, so it was kind of fun seeing him. I think it was like a year before he did the first Haunted Mask episode. It was also fun in the comic book store. Like there's a couple little like cardboard displays of other dark monsters on there. Like you see the Crimson Clown and the Dark Dragon were the two that kind of stood out to me. There was a couple more in between, but I didn't recognize them. But it was just kind of fun to see those little references to other dark creatures in this comic book store. I think all the characters were really fun. The comic store owner, she was really fun and just kind of had this energy to her. You know, I can't remember her name, but the nerdy friend that helps Ethan along the way, she was really fun. Amos Crawley, of course, was great. The guy who played the Masked Mutant. Oh my gosh, the Ghastly Grinner was great. And yeah, it was just a really fun episode that I just really enjoyed, and I just think that it's easily one that everyone who is maybe getting into dark or kids horror definitely should check out.
Yeah, I agree.
I gave it like a 9 out of 10.
I think it's a great like first episode for Dark to kind of like show you what the capabilities of the show are, and like you should watch this over stuff like Long Ago Locket, people. So so let's get into Spongy, see what he says, and then we'll start with Spongy's comparison on both, and then we'll get into what the victor is.
All right, so this is Spongy's thoughts about the Ghastly Grinner episode. So his thoughts are, this is the latter of the episodes that Ron Oliver wrote on top of directing, and just like Full Moon, this is pure camp. But while that one was good, this one I like more. I really liked it. As usual, we have those Dutch angles and all those Oliverisms, but this goes the extra mile. There's some neat transitions and sometimes kind of Danny Elfman-ish music. Every character is weird, from the couch potato parents to the very 90s nerd Hooper Picolaro, I think, okay, so that's her name, who sits next to him in Mr. Wrightson's class. I like the protagonist, this kid who keeps getting rejected despite his talents. He could have been a jerk, but he's not, and he gets along with Hooper off the bat when I expected a thing of him forcing himself to work with the nerd. I love how she owns the fact, by the way. The moral of believing in yourself is corny, but it works in adding substance. The Grinner is a fun villain, and the whole idea is cool. The stuff that he does to people is goofy and creepy at the same time, the right mix. The part with the bus driver was especially crazy. It takes a bit to get up to all that, but we get enough time to explore it. Sometimes the sound effects or shots can be a bit much, and the style won't vibe with everyone, but since it's a big fan favorite, it seems that most don't mind it. The microwave aspect was kind of weird. They at least explain how the Ghastly Grinner comes to life, but that part was weird to me. The climax is cool, but it does something I can tell if it's neat or lazy low. The ending is satisfying at least. It's just such a fun time with all the campiness I love, as well as a mostly solid story. It just works, and I enjoyed it from start to finish. It's a good time. Also, on the back of the comic is an ad for two Nick things, one of which are You Afraid of the Dark? The universe should have imploded right there.
I love Spongy's points because y'all really don't know how fun this episode is unless you watch it. And like, even if you're not a fan of campy stuff or just out of this world, like it shouldn't work on paper stuff, give this episode a try because you'll find something within your inner child, especially if you're older, that will gravitate to you through this. So let's read Spongy's comparison and then we'll get into the victor.
So this is Spongy's concluding thoughts on which he likes more. Yeah, Ghastly Grinner gets the easy win here. Attack of the Mutant has its good ideas, and I don't mind the approach of a more slowly building up to the mutant, but having the comic villain be a bigger presence worked better. Grinner has a stronger protagonist and a better thought out story with enough substance in there. Hardly the deepest, but it helps it not to be mindless. Grinner having some scary stuff alongside the camp makes it more effective and a fun package for me. Even the episode of the Attack of the Mutant doesn't hit like Ghastly Grinner does, although I do find the supporting characters more fun in the Mutant episode, honestly. But yeah, Grinner is tighter, combines fun and horror in a strong way, and overall comes out as the better one. Another solid W for Dark. Shout out to the Mass Mutant audiobook, which has Invader Zim as Skipper and Bart Simpson as Libby. I didn't know that they got that. That's
Oh
cool.
wow! I'm gonna have to listen to that.
Bart
I'm assuming
Simpson.
that's the Walt Disney one.
Yeah. Art Simpson is crazy. That's awesome.
Wow. All right, so Spongy gives the victory to Ghastly Grinner, and by no surprise, I think we all agree that Grinner easily beats Attack the Mutant, either version.
Yeah.
Even this little TV book here, I think Ghastly Grinner just wipes the floor with Attack the Mutant. And I think where it comes down to, not only is the execution, but if you compare the book and even the episode of Mutant to Ghastly Grinner, look at its pace. Look at what you get with the titular villains of each story. You have the masked mutant. The mutant is in the title of the story. You have the tale of the Ghastly Grinner, the name of the titular villain. Who do you see more? You see more of the Grinner. You get more horror. You get more camp. You get more comic book vibes. It gives you a lot more atmosphere, a better character to chew on. Dark, you knocked it out of the park with a comic book horror story, especially for the 90s. You get the easy W over anything Goosebumps put out, period, in terms of comic books. So I have to give you that. Maybe Haunting Hour will give you a run for your money, but we'll save that for a discussion. Because our discussion tonight, we're going to keep it kind of short since it's just us three, is basically about comic book horror and kids horror, right? So I guess I'll start this off because the modern Goosebumps lens is tainted with this character, and I just want to say my piece of hate on a certain character, Dr. Maniac. Yo, let me be honest. My boy, the Masked Mutant, he might have gotten done a little bit dirty in his book and in his episode. He might have had a video game spinoff that I actually remember playing as a kid, the PC game. That was kind of fun, and like a Doom dungeon crawler type of way. But the fact that he only got one book in a video game, and this guy Doctor Mania got 3 books in Modern Goosebumps before Mutant never got a sequel, is insulting. Arnold Stein, let me prod your mind a little bit here. How much drugs did you do when you came up with Dr. Maniac? Okay, let me just throw that question out there if you're out there listening, because those books are a cluster mess of just hodgepodge random stuff happening. BD likes to say go go gadget random bullshit. That is essentially the first 2 Dr. Maniac books from start to finish. I have never read more messier Goosebumps books than those. But somehow you gave the guy 3 appearances. Shame on you. And yeah, I've read all three books. I've ranked them. You all know my thoughts on them. Easily the best is They Call Me Night Howler, but that book is actually a ripoff of a Nightmare Room book that I think BD's going to bring up. So BD, bring up a certain Nightmare Room book that you wanted to talk about, and whatever else you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I actually got I think three comic stories. One of them I'll briefly bring up because I'm gonna give Micah the floor to talk about it because I know he's seen that one. But the first one, I think I'm the only one who's read this book out of us. So the Nightmare Room has a book called Shadow Girl, and I will say this, and I know Spongy, he was in this obviously discussion. He's gonna agree with me. Me and him have talked about this book before. Shadow Girl is the best R.L. Stine comic story he's ever written, and this book is how he should have been writing all the other comic book stories. For those of you who have not read Shadow Girl by Nightmare Room, pick it up and please read it. Even if you don't like superhero stories, I think you're all going to get something out of this one. This book is about a girl named Selena. And actually, first, I want to give a shout out to the cover of the book. The cover of the book is the shot of this house, this dark sky, and then you have the shot of Shadow Girl. And Shadow Girl looks like Raven from Teen Titans. So if you like Raven from Teen Titans, that's the design of Shadow Girl. Shadow Girl is about this girl named Selena. And due to some, I think, problems with her family or her mom or something, she has to be sent away to live with her aunt, uncle, and I think her cousin named Jada. And what happens is that she has to go to Chicago. Your boy is a Chicago native. The fact that the story takes place in Chicago is dope, and it does actually play a part into the story. Selena goes there to this house, and she's very much not good on terms with her cousin. They get into a lot of fights, they get into a lot of arguments. She has to start at a new school, and Jada actually embarrasses her at the school, so it gets off to a very rough start. And some weird stuff starts happening around this Chicago neighborhood. Obviously, it's Chicago. There's a lot of crime. No, there's not shootings and crackheads, which is what real Chicago is. But there are some goons out there at the night robbing and getting into some mischief. And there's an unknown vigilante who's going out there and basically taking down all of these people, beating them up and saving a lot of civilians. So Selena basically starts getting interested into Jada because she notices that Jada sneaks out at night a lot, and she starts having some suspicions that the vigilante figure may in fact be Jada. But there ends up being a situation where Jada reveals that she does have some superhero ties, but now it's put on to Selena for her to save Jada. And what happens is Selena has to take on the Shadow Girl costume, put it on, and it gives her abilities. And there's actually a scene in the book that involves this middle school girl, Selena, going to a gas station and saving some people who are getting beat up and mugged by some goons with pipes and bats and stuff. So she beats up all these guys that have pipes and like bats. They try using melee on her, and she completely wipes the floor with them. She's been practicing her powers. It's a straight up Spider-Man type of scene. If you've ever read Spider-Man or watched the MCU movies, it's like that. And would you expect Stein write something like that? Hell no. That's not what usually he does in Goosebumps, but you get that here. And the book reveals that this whole family may have some superhero ties. And let's just say that Selena, the main character, has to fight somebody that's very close to her and her family by the end of the book. And it's a literal Superman versus, I don't know, another flying villain type of scene. It's a really awesome action scene at the end of the book. So that's a great book. I gave that one, I think, like a 9 point something out of 10. It's fantastic. I love it. And I want to give another quick shout out to another story. Um, I'm going to briefly mention Brush with Madness from Haunting Hour. That's another great one, but I'll let Micah talk about it. But there's actually an adult horror episode from a TV show that was cheesy enough and not as violent and dark as the show usually goes that I think kids can watch. And that's from Tales from the Crypt. Corbin's Calamity is an episode that a lot of you guys should watch because it's not as dark and as disturbing as a lot of Tales from the Crypt episodes are. It can actually be watched by kids, and it's actually a meta story. It involves a writer who works at Tales from the Crypt Comics who's having some relationship problems. His wife is sort of burdening him, and he ends up finding a love interest with a police officer. And as he starts basically doing his work at Tales from the Crypt, making comics, all of his drawings of monsters start coming to life and they start wreaking havoc around the city. So people start getting attacked by it. All of his monster designs can basically spawn to life. and the police officer and him have to find a way to basically solve all these different mysteries and find a way to stop these monsters from coming to life. And it ends on a very kumbaya ending. So that's one I recommend to you guys. Yes, it's from an adult horror show, but it's basically a kids' horror episode. There's really only one scene that's kind of dark. It's like a beheading scene, and it's not that dragged on. So please go give that a watch as well and pick up Shadow Girl.
Great picks. Corman's Calamity, good episode. And I like that you brought up Rushford Madness, but Mike is going to talk about that. And of course, Shadow Girl. I still need to read that. That's one of my big bucket list books from Nightmare Room. So, going to get to that sooner than later. But Micah, why don't you talk about what you wanted to bring to the table for this?
Yeah. So I will talk about Brushwood Madness from The Haunting Hour, another R.L. Stine comic book story. Now, whether R.L. Stine actually wrote this, I do not know, but it's part of an R.L. Stine show. And basically, this episode stars Dylan Minnette, who is obviously Zach in the Goosebumps movie. So that's kind of fun seeing him in another R.L. Stine project before he got involved with Goosebumps. But basically, it's about him and his best friend. I can't remember the character's name. I think his name is Corey in the episode. But Corey and his best friend are going to this comic book convention. They're both big comic book nerds, and Corey is a big fan of this particular artist. And while they're at this convention, it's kind of revealed that this artist that Corey admires is having some kind of stalker situation that he's very paranoid about. And he's trying to he's just worried that something's going to happen to him. And when Corey goes up to meet him, he says just the wrong amount of things to make this artist paranoid and think that Corey may actually be the stalker. And he kind of dismisses Corey and is very rude to him, yells at him. And so Corey, kind of feeling dejected and angry, steals this guy's brushes and brings him back to his house. And basically he starts creating his own comic creating this character called the Mad Artist, which may be a bit of a jab at this artist who kind of dejected him. And he realizes that as he's painting these panels, he starts painting things that reflect real life. Like he paints a picture of the Mad Artist standing outside of his window, and he looks outside and the Mad Artist is standing in the corner. And it kind of becomes to the point where he's almost obsessively painting these panels. Like it starts getting painted all over his walls, and it's just almost like he's under a trance as he starts painting these. And things just get more and more dangerous as the Mad Artist starts targeting his friend. And it kind of all culminates in this very kind of dark ending where Corey and his friend are trapped by the Mad Artist, and something horrible is implied to happen to them at the end of the episode. And it's a really fun time. It's a lot of good, creepy building tension. It's a kind of a slow burn episode, but it's a slow burn done right. It kind of has these it kind of has those little hints of things happening that don't reveal anything too much until the ending. And I think it just really works building that kind of intrigue in that episode. And I think, the characters all do a pretty good job in it. The Mad Artist is a pretty cool and intimidating villain. And it's just a fun episode overall that I enjoy. So
yeah, Brush with Madness, another great pick. I think minus the Dr. Maniac books, Brush with Madness, Shadow Girl, Corman's Calamity. I mean, what was the other one that we talked about? All those, I think, are infinitely better than Attack the Mutant, personally. Minus Dr. Maniac, like I said. But I think comic book horror, the reason why it's not done a lot in kids' horror, as BD kind of brought up with Shadow Girl's plot, most of the time they're playing on that old school Corman's Calamity, Tales from the Crypt idea of a comic story by going meta with the comics, bringing them to life into reality. It's kind of like that Jumanji effect that it has on board game horror, right? Where everything kind of feels like that typecasted thing. There's not a lot of diversity within the superhero genre that I feel authors, I guess, can bring to the table. That's why you just don't see it that much. And mine is like maybe they call me the Night Howler and Shadow Girl, which are basically clones of each other. I haven't seen much else different from that Corman's Calamity setup. And it's kind of a shame because I think superhero horror can kind of bridge the gap between media for kids. Like they can go from reading comic books and seeing something like Attack of the Mutant can bring them in and possibly, they can find maybe a niche genre they like, but there's just not a lot to consume there and not a lot of diversity in there. So if you're out there, kids horror writers, and you're listening, take a shot at making a kid's horror story with superheroes and try to see what you can bring to the table. If you want to tell a more thematic story, go ahead. If you want to be off the wall bonkers, not necessarily on acid like Stein was writing Dr. Maniac, but you can, go wild with it if you want. I think most people would be on board with that and might actually get you people to try out your stuff a little more. But with that being said, I think that wraps up podcast 18, the superhero face off, Attack the Mutant, and the Tale of the Ghastly Grinner. For episode 19, we actually have some Woods in the Summertime stories planned for you. So we're going to be kind of stepping away from Goosebumps for this one, but it's a really good one. It's a fan favorite Haunting Hour episode. We're going to be facing off Dreamcatcher from the Haunting Hour against kind of a lesser known but still respected Are You Afraid of the Dark episode, and that is the Tale of the Watcher's Woods. So stay tuned for next episode if you're into creepy woods in the summertime horror stories. I want to thank Micah and BD as well as Spongy. I'm going to put all of our information down in the description and in the comment section. If you would like to go sub us up or follow us on some other social media platforms, feel free. Like BD said earlier, if you like the podcast, it's free to drop a like. It's free to leave a comment and tell us your thoughts about which ones you like more. Do you like Attack the Mutant more? Do you like the Tale of the Ghastly Grinner more? And maybe you can give us some ideas of what you would like to see faced off in future podcasts, or maybe like to see us do that's not facing off things. Who knows? But until next time, take care, everyone. Have a great night, and we'll see you all later. Bye.